Good afternoon, everyone. I think we still have some people joining in, but we'd like to start on time. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the online launch of Lanka Dispatch, mapping Sri Lanka's place in the world. So this publication really was born out of a need that we realized because Arutha as an organization has been mapping Sri Lanka-China relations for over 2 years. And as the years go by, you realize that Sri Lanka's economic future is reliant on a much more complex political economy, and that required us to broaden our horizons. And the Lanka Dispatch is really the fruit of that labor. As we see in the world today, especially with the current conflict in West Asia, Sri Lanka's economy is very much reliant on what happens in the global economy. And we will have Shaheen Abdulghani, our research assistant, exploring that topic, as well as looking at Sri Lanka's trade story from last year, which is a story of unexpected resilience in the face of many shocks, including the Liberation Day tariffs. We will also be looking a little more regionally at Sri Lanka's relationship with its neighbors, particularly in times of crisis, and look a little bit deeper into Cyclone Ditwah and who came to our aid first and foremost, which is, of course, India, and look a little bit deeper at that relationship, both in terms of government to government, as well as people to people, especially in relation to our growing number of Indian tourists. And finally, we will also be looking at something a little bit lighter, which is, of course, cricket and the way in which Sri Lanka has leveraged its position as the umpire of South Asia. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Shaheen, who will be taking us through the first two sections. Shaheen, over to you.
Thank you, Yolani. Good evening, everybody. As Yolani mentioned, I will be looking at two aspects. The first is the impact of the current war in West Asia, as well as our trade over the past year. So there's apologies for that. So there's a tendency to think that just because we aren't directly in the West Asia region, that the conflict there isn't really our problem. But what a lot of people forget to realize is that Sri Lanka is a part of the global economy. And what's happening in West Asia right now is arguably one of the biggest shocks that the global economy has faced in the past couple of years. The United Nations has gone on to flag Sri Lanka as one of the worst impacted countries in the entire Asia Pacific region because of the war. So I would argue that this is very much our problem. And we're already feeling it, right? Across food, across fuel, and fertilizer. Let's start with fuel. The Strait of Hormuz, located between Iran and Oman, is one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. It carries around 30,000 ships every year, carrying 38% of global crude oil, 29% of LPG, and 19% of LNG. So when the strait closes, like it did on the 2nd of March 2026, global supply gets disrupted immediately. Now, Sri Lanka buys 38% of its oil from the United Arab Emirates, also known as the UAE. With the ongoing conflict and critical energy facilities being hit multiple times, the UAE has reduced its production and therefore supply has taken a big hit. Since March, you might have also noticed that fuel prices have risen by over 35% in Sri Lanka. Gas and electricity rates have followed a similar amount. And if you haven't noticed it now, you will definitely notice it in the upcoming billing cycle at the end of this month. Now, to put it in concrete terms, according to data from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, our oil import bill has almost doubled since the closure of the strait. In February 2026, fuel imports cost us $398 million. And 1 month later, in March 2026, that number has reached 630 million US dollars. And this number is only going to rise if the conflict persists. Now, according to the president, the actual cost of a liter of diesel is 720 rupees, but it's being sold to you and I at 392 rupees. So the gap between is currently being absorbed by the government and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. And the president, at a very recent convening, made it clear that this cannot go on. It definitely can't go on for a long period of time. Now, let's talk about food and fertilizer, which is actually where the longer term risks actually sit, and one that we often ignore or forget to consider or give importance. 30% of the global fertilizer transits go through the strait. And Gulf nations are the major producers of nitrogen based fertilizers like urea. And because the strait is blockaded, currently by both Iran and the US, supply has tightened and therefore prices have shot up, reflecting not just a shortage, but also higher shipping costs and war insurance premiums. And then in March, China, our largest source of fertilizer imports, halted all its fertilizer exports to protect its own domestic food security. Now, that has reduced supply even further at exactly the wrong time. And now we're starting to see very real downstream effects. Low fertilizer availability means low agricultural output. Crops used in food production, such as maize for poultry and eggs, for example, are bound to be affected. Prices will definitely rise. And if the conflict continues to persist into the next growing season, it could affect our cultivation in the upcoming Maha season. So the war in West Asia is no longer a hypothetical scenario. It is now a very near term risks that we need to be planning for. And it doesn't just stop there. Sri Lanka imports a large share of its essential foods. One third of our domestic cereal comes from abroad. Did you know that 80% of our Mysore dal is coming from Australia? Now, last year, we imported 74,000 metric tons of dairy. And 86% of that came single handedly from New Zealand alone. Now, it's important to realize that just like us, these countries also rely on imported inputs. So, when there are disruptions in global supply chains, it's bound to have a ripple effect on their production and therefore us as well. So it's time to realize that the conflict isn't just happening in a vacuum. Countries across the globe are making very difficult choices to protect themselves. Let's talk about India because it's been in the news recently. It's one of the world's largest producers of sugar. And very recently, it had banned its sugar exports with immediate effect until September 2026 in order to stabilize its domestic prices. India is also set to import a record 2.5 million metric tons of urea in a single tender at a price double of what they paid 2 months ago in order to protect their own domestic food security as the conflict is driving up global prices. China has also halted fertilizer exports for the same reason, like I told you. So, when major producers prioritize their domestic supply over international trade, Sri Lanka is amongst the first to feel it. Now, it's important for us to highlight here that Sri Lanka is in a very precarious situation because I would argue that we're already on the back foot. Our food security has taken three consistent consecutive blows, right? First, the economic crisis in 2022, during which most people were unable to afford proper nutritious meals, and some still do struggle with the same thing. Then we had Cyclone Ditwah last year, which significantly affected our domestic production, as we know, and caused wide scale damage. And now the conflict in West Asia. So, three blows to our food security, one after the other. So it's time to realize that the conflict in West Asia is no longer background noise. It's actively shaping the cost of running our economy, what we pay for fuel, what we pay for food, what farmers can afford to put into the ground. In our opinion, it also raises an important question that we believe has been avoided for far too long. Why are we as a country so dependent on other countries for the food that feeds us, especially essential items or things that are in our Sri Lankan diet? Now, the government has said that they are working on their solutions, but we argue that some of those solutions need to go beyond just managing the current crisis and start addressing why we are exposed to this kind of risk in the first place. Now, let's talk about trade. So on the 2nd of April 2025, all of us woke up to the news that President Donald Trump had announced a country-specific tariff of 44% on Sri Lankan exports on what he called Liberation Day. And almost instantly and understandably, everybody panicked. So, initial estimates and expert commentaries suggested that Sri Lanka could face a 20% reduction in its apparel exports, a loss of 3 billion US dollars in export revenue, and a GDP decline of 1.5%. This was what the United Nations had predicted. And then you add to that the uncertainty around the rate itself. The tariff was paused almost immediately for negotiations. Then it came down to 20%. Then in February 2026, it was ruled invalid by the US Supreme Court. And then it had been replaced by a new flat 10% global tariff. So in the space of about 10 to 12 months, 11 months, the applicable rate had moved about 4 times. So I would argue that the panic was definitely not unfounded. The rules of global trade, as you and I have known, are being rewritten in real time, and none of us have a clear playbook as to how to go about dealing with it. But now that a year has passed and the dust has settled, it's actually worth asking what happened to Sri Lanka's exports through all of this. And the short answer is better than anyone expected. Despite the disruption, our merchandise exports grew to $12.4 billion last year, a 6% year-on-year increase. The apparel and textile sector, the one that everyone was most worried about and that was going to have the biggest impact because of the tariffs, also rose by 5%. And exports to the US specifically also increased by 2% in the apparel and textile markets. I know 2% is not a lot, but considering the whole disruption because of the tariffs, it's still something that I believe is noteworthy. So at the end of the day, the end result of the tariffs and the whole chaos around it was neither a drop in volume nor a drop in earnings. But there's a very important factor here that we believe isn't being, that people don't know yet. And that is that the US alone is not the whole story when it comes to our trade, to our export performance. What helped us was also Europe. So our exports to the European Union grew by 13% cumulatively in 2025. And this was primarily driven by continued preferential access under the GSP Plus scheme. Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, France, and Belgium all recorded very strong growth last year. So when there was uncertainty around the American market, the preferential access to the EU is what acted as a real buffer for it. And the government knows and acknowledges it, right? Which is why in February 2026, President Dissanayake was in Paris, where he spoke about continuing the GSP Plus access that we currently have. From 2026, we are also expected to gain similar preferential access to the United Kingdom through the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, which further strengthens our position in Europe. Now let's talk about our closest neighbor, India. In 2025, India became our second largest export destination, overtaking the United Kingdom, with exports growing by over 17%. Now, a key part of this is the India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, which has been in place since 2000. There are some issues with it, but I would argue that it's still very, very helpful. And there are ongoing negotiations on a deeper economic and technology cooperation agreement, the ECTA, which could extend further into services and investment. In our report, we argue that the broader takeaway is that Sri Lanka's export sector has held up in 2025, and it has held up because of diversification. Market diversification that has been particularly built on trade agreements that have been in place for a while now. So that's genuinely very good news for us. But we argue that resilience alone is not a strategy. You would see that our regional peers are not just surviving shocks like we are, but they are building supply chains, moving up the value curve, and locking in new markets. Again, all in an attempt to not be disrupted by events like what we are seeing in the current global economy. The question is, will we be able to do so, and how fast? Now, that's a little bit about our export story that we have discussed in this first issue. We also have our import story, and I would suggest that you have a look at our publication for that. Having that said, I'd now like to pass the floor to my colleague Charuka.
Thank you, Shaheen. Now, since Shaheen mentioned bunch of crises that we are already facing, for a moment, just imagine you are going through a crisis. It could be a financial one, a natural disaster like Ditwa, or even a health emergency. What if I told you that there is a better chance that the Indian government would come to your rescue even faster than your own neighbor? I mean, jokes aside, this is the reality. Over the last 5 years, India has been our first responder. In 2022, during the financial crisis, India was one of the first countries that stepped forward to help us. Indian Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar by that time quoted that blood is thicker than water. And under Neighborhood First policy, India extended $4 billion in financial assistance. And India took a prominent role in Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process, as well as they gave the final crucial financing assurance that was needed for IMF program approval back in March 2023. Now, after 2 years, Sri Lanka was hit by the biggest natural disaster since tsunami. And then it was India again that became the first responder. If you remember the first 72 hours, the immediate aftermath of Cyclone Ditwah, it was very, very crucial. Roads were cut off, there was no electricity, and literally central province was isolated, right? India immediately launched the Operation Sagar Bandhu. Naval vessels like INS Vikrant and Udayagiri, they were already here and supported search and rescue operations. And then the air operations, they were deployed for the evacuations. More than 2000, this was a really important for a country that depends heavily on tourism. Not only that, there was a $450 million financial relief package also. Now, does this mean the other countries didn't help? Absolutely not. The US, United States, they launched the high visibility air operations and they focus on to reaching the communities that was cut off by the damaged roads and sea roads. And on the financial terms, they have already $4 million in financial aid and the logistics support. When we look at the Chinese situation, they contributed $1 million in financial aid along with the technical teams for the long-term planning. And we saw that genuine solidarity from the Maldives, from Pakistan, and Japan. They delivered technical and financial support when it mattered. Every one of these contributions was real. But here is the difference. The US came with precision, China came with a long-term plan, but India came immediately, stayed through the reconstruction, and backed it with the financial assistance. No other partner operated across all three phases of emergency, relief, and rebuilding as a single continuous mission. Now, back to where we started this discussion. If you are in a crisis, who actually comes for you? For Sri Lanka over the last 5 years, that answer has been very consistent. India arrived first, stayed the longest, and did the most. And this is not because of the geography, but because of the political will in New Delhi and the preparation and the relationship that holds under the pressure. And this is what exactly a first responder looks like. And as we move forward, we will see exactly why this relationship matters more than ever. India is now our number one tourism market. By 2025, Indian arrivals accounted for, that is up from 17% in 2022. And it is more than double the share of United Kingdom. United Kingdom is our second largest market. This is a remarkable shift and it happens only in 3 years. So we need to understand how did exactly happen. Part of the answer is heritage. Sri Lanka actively promoted things like Ramayana Trail and Sita Elia, sites connected to the ancient epic that both countries share. It gave Indian visitors a reason to come that went beyond beaches and hotels. But we know that heritage alone doesn't move numbers at this scale, but connectivity does. Indigo expanded aggressively over this period, growing its share of inbound traffic from 4.9 to 4.9 in 2022 to 12% in 2025. It means more frequency. More frequency means lower barriers. Sri Lanka became a realistic option for Indian middle class for a weekend getaway or even things like a destination wedding. Taken together, the heritage marketing and the air connectivity and then people to people ties, the growth in Indian tourism wasn't just a result of grand strategy. It was Sri Lanka leaning into a relationship that was already there and deepening it deliberately. For a small island nation like Sri Lanka that is still recovering from an economic crisis, this relationship has become one of our most important economic assets. And when we look at Sri Lanka, we all know that we have a reputation in South Asia that most countries would envy actually. In a region that defined by rivalry and tension, we have managed to maintain working relationships with everyone. This is not a small feat. And if there is one thing that Sri Lanka is actually genuinely good at, it is leveraging that position through soft power and cultural diplomacy. I will explain this by one example. Personally, this is one of my favorite areas that I have researched and spoken about since my undergraduate times. Finally, after so many years, we were able to witness what red ball diplomacy really means, or the cricket diplomacy really means. For years, we have talked about why Sri Lanka cannot be a common ground to host bilateral cricket matches between India and Pakistan, because we know other than the ICC tournaments, India and Pakistan are now not playing any sort of bilateral cricket matches. And after all these years, we finally saw that Sri Lanka actually has the capacity to do that. I will quickly walk you through what happened. I hope all of you know that from March to May, it is basically the IPL festival, right? Indian Premier League. So the Bangladeshi player, Mustafizur, he's a bowler, and he was supposed to play in this IPL. But BCCI rejected him. And I have to say this was mainly due to the political matters. And then Bangladesh cricket team opted out of the World Cup, which was scheduled earlier this year from January to February, saying they were not safe enough to play in India. Following this, Pakistan cricket team also said, okay, if you are not coming to the World Cup, we would not play against India. And this match was scheduled to be played in Colombo. Now, in financial terms, this was a massive hit for both Sri Lanka as well as the ICC, International Cricket Council. Because when it comes to the revenue generation, there is no bigger game than India versus Pakistan. At this specific moment, the Sri Lankan government intervened and ensured safety for Pakistan. And after a number of high-level discussions, they finally agreed to play this game. And if we look at the statistics, during the first week of February itself, from 1st of February to 12th, more than 100,000 tourists came to Sri Lanka. They were mainly from Pakistan and India, which was 19% more than in 2025. And airfares, they rocketed up to USD 1,000. And hotels across Colombo were fully booked with average room pricing reaching to more than USD 600. And most importantly, Sri Lanka demonstrated that it could serve as a stabilizing neutral space in South Asian region. And if we look at all these things, for a small nation, being everyone's trend is not a grand strategy. It is how we thrive, and this has been our main diplomacy for the last 5 to 6 years. Mapping Sri Lanka's place in the world, this is where Sri Lanka stands today. A war in West Asia tightening our economy, and our economy is under pressure. And every day we have to be carefully navigate between world's biggest powers. But here is what gives us the confidence. Our trade held up, exports grew, and we brought rivals to the same pitch. And tourism-wise, it's recovering, led by the deepening relationships with our closest neighbors. Sri Lanka does not have the luxury of picking sides right now. But what we have shown through Cyclone Ditwah, through the diplomacy, through our trade numbers, is the middle path is not a compromise. It is our strategy, and so far it's working. And if you need more information on all of these things, please look into our flagship publication, Lanka Dispatch Issue 1. Thank you, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions at the Q&A. Back to you, Yolani.